Hey there, good evening, welcome. Y'all okay if we get started? Take that as a quiet yes. For those of you I haven't met, or for those of you who are new to this space, you're at Reservoir Church in our chapel. I'm Steve Watson, I'm the senior pastor of this community. Reservoir is functionally a post-evangelical church. We say we're here to invite people to discover the love of God, the gift of community, and the joy of living. For some of you, this is your church. For others, it's not. Welcome to the space. We're glad that you're here. One of the friends of Reservoir is tonight's featured speaker, Reverend Dr. David Gushee. At the same time that Reservoir was leaving its network of churches called Vineyard Churches for a variety of reasons, but the most presenting issue was to allow us to be fully inclusive and blessing of the spiritual lives and marriages, et cetera, of LGBTQ people at a time that Vineyard was disallowing that. And at the same time, really the exact same time, David Gushee, who's a very prominent Christian ethicist, maybe the most prominent Christian ethicist in evangelical spaces, was on his own journey in that same direction and published an important book, which I believe is called Changing My Mind. Changing Our Mind. It wasn't just your mind. A lot of our minds have been changed. You spoke for me, too. Changing Our Mind around in a case for full LGBTQ inclusion in the church. And during those years, we had the opportunity to get to know David as a community, and I had the opportunity to experience David as an elder and a mentor and a friend in this work, which he has continued to be over the past 10 years. David's published, I said I wouldn't give a formal introduction, but David's published really extensively, and he's spoken and written on many important topics, taking a lead in a case against torture, though many Christians were supporting it back in the 90s, and a variety of other things over the years. This weekend, his talk he's giving tomorrow, if you're interested, preaching in our service at 9:30, relates to his just published book called The Moral Teachings of Jesus. It's fabulous, 40 chapters in this tiny book, so they're very short for people with short attention spans like myself. They're short and powerful, deeply informed by scholarship, and richly practical as well. Tonight, of course, David last year published this book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies, and here in election season, we have the opportunity to hear David speak about this book and his work on Christians that oppose democracy and a case for the Christian support of democracy. I'm so excited to hear David speak. Both of these two books are for sale afterwards. If you're interested, we're selling them for $15. And after, what will happen tonight is David's going to speak for a while. I'll give more of a longer talk. And then a local scholar that I was introduced through some networking around this event is here as well, Dr. Sarah Riccardi-Schwartz. I'm just going to do your intro now, too. From Northeastern University, is an anthropologist who works in anthropology and religion. And she, too, studies things that get called Christian nationalism or authoritarian reaction Christianity in the United States, and some connection to Putin's Russia. And it's an honor, Sarah, to have you two to be able to respond to David's talk for a little bit. And after that, we'll open this up for some question and response for anywhere from like a few minutes, if it's all you've got, up until 9 o'clock, if you've got a lot of things you want to ask and talk about. Looking forward to this evening. And again, David, so grateful that you've come to visit. David's been a gracious friend to me and to this church, and thanks for being a friend to us again. So welcome, David.
Well, it is good to be back at Reservoir Church, good to be back in Cambridge, and thank you all for coming out. There are other things you could be doing on a Saturday night. Not much in Boston, nothing going on. So thank you for being here, and I'm grateful for the invitation and really glad to be kind of on a tour during this election season in different places, talking about trying to make sense of what's happening with democracy in this country and the Christian relationship to democracy in this country. And so I have a kind of a distillation of the argument in this book that I'll share with you this evening, and I look forward to hearing from Sarah, and then your, I'm sure, very thoughtful questions. So thanks for being here. And again, Steve, thank you for the invitation. Steve is leaving. He's heard enough. He's heard enough. Are you coming back?
Sorry, you mentioned
Okay, all right, yeah.
I'm keeping an eye out for latecomers.
Okay. A pastor's work is never done, right? So, this book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies, you might say the most provocative thing about the book is its title. To describe any group of Christians as enemies of democracy is to make a pretty strong claim. I think it's an accurate claim, and maybe you'll agree or not agree by the time you hear the argument or read the book. But in essence, the book is an analysis of a disturbing trend among Christians in a number of countries, both historically and today, towards an authoritarianism that is a threat to democracy and has, in fact, undercut or contributed to the erosion of democracy in different countries at different eras. The book is also intended to offer current, contemporary Christian defense of democracy as a political system in a time when that defense needs to be offered. There are periods in which you have to, in a democracy, you have to renew the case for why a democracy is the preferable political system to the alternatives. I think that moment is where we find ourselves. So this book engages political theory and practice, democratic theory and so on, as well as historic Christian political thought. It also offers a historic and cross-national account of anti-democratic tendencies among Christians in multiple countries. It's not a book just about this moment or just about our country, but it definitely intends to speak to this moment, an election season, and this country. The goal of the book is to help Christians renew their commitment to democracy and to resist the seductive allure of a certain kind of authoritarian Christian politics. This is a book which breaks somewhat new conceptual ground. For example, I do not accept that the language of Christian nationalism is the best term or the best descriptive category to name the problem, at least the one that I see, so you'll hear about that this evening. It is a book that intends to be fair, to offer descriptions of the people that I'm arguing with that could be recognized by them as accurate. It's not a partisan screed. In fact, it's not partisan at all. The friends of this book would be anybody committed to defending our democratic principles and practices. You'll understand the substance of this talk if by the end you know what two acronyms mean. I'll start off with a diagnosis under the label ARC, and then I'll offer a prescription under the label DCA. So this is a talk that intends to be moving from diagnosis to prescription, from ARC to DCA. And so at the end, you'll be quizzed, because after all, we're in the general area of Harvard, right? So any time is a good time for another test. So let's talk about what's going wrong, the diagnostic side, the ARC side. I'm trying in this part of the talk to sympathetically or empathetically enter into the moral imagination and the political imagination of rather sizable populations in the US and in other countries. And it's not all that hard for me to do because having once been an evangelical Christian, I understand and know a lot of folks who are in this space, and maybe some of you do too. So let's say that our beginning point is folks who are devoutly Christian, traditional in their formulations of their doctrinal and moral and religious commitments, who, rooted in those faith commitments, find themselves to be deeply distressed at the overall direction of their country. If you ask them to say, how do you feel things are going in your country, they would say, we pretty much don't like anything major that has happened in the country for many decades. At least in the religion and values arena, the country appears to have lost its mind or lost its soul. And they really believe this, and they really mean it. Part of the intensity of the feeling is the belief on the part of this population that it used to be better back in the day, that, that more people in the past shared the traditional religious and moral values that this population still holds. And so the sense of holding firm to convictions that are largely being abandoned around them is part of the pathos here. Now, this idea of there being a religiously, morally, traditionalist, conservative, religious population in a society that is feeling very unhappy at trends that move the society away from their beliefs, it's not only necessarily a Christian issue. It could happen in any country. It could happen, for example, with traditionalist Hindus in India, or traditionalist Muslims in Turkey, or traditionalist Jews in Israel. In fact, I mention all three in the book as maybe relevant parallels. But I'm a Christian ethicist. I work from within the Christian framework, and my calling as a Christian ethicist has always been to try to help Christians be the best version of ourselves, the best followers of Jesus that we can be. And so as a Christian ethicist, I focus on this particular expression of, you might call it traditionalist panic in Christian populations. And so it could be, and in fact is, a problem for Orthodox populations in Eastern Europe, including in Russia, for Catholic populations in Poland or other Catholic regions of the world, for it could be Anglicans, traditionalist Anglicans in British Commonwealth countries. It could be Lutherans in Sweden, or Calvinists in the Netherlands, or Protestant fundamentalists, evangelicals, and Pentecostals in Brazil or the US. In fact, you can find this cluster of values and concerns among all of these populations. And there are scholars who are working on traditionalist religious kind of politics in multiple settings. So to think about the Christians again, especially the Christians who are in this place. What are they not happy about? Well, they witness the fading of Christian belief, practice, and influence in their country, and they don't like it. They don't like seeing churches close or shrink and then close. They don't like seeing the influence of their religious beliefs fading in their communities. They don't like feeling that they're losing their own children and grandchildren. They don't like the abandonment of moral beliefs that they believe are not just somebody's opinion, but God's will. They see these changes as rebellion against God, bad for people, and bad for the country. They don't like cultural and lifestyle and legal changes that are associated with these belief changes. And if you just even think about our country over the last 60 years, when you listen to them and you look at this trajectory over time, it really begins in the late 50s. Various targets of concern have been featured at different times when they first came up. It could be, for example, the rise in the divorce rate during the 60s, or the greater acceptance of sex outside of marriage, the LGBTQ movement in the 60s, 70s, and beyond, the rising power of the feminist movement and the rising role of women in positions of influence and power. It could be abortion. It could be Supreme Court decisions related to prayer and Bible reading in schools. It could be drugs. It could also be, in some cases, the sense that patriotism was fading and that people were being rebellious against authority. These and other concerns are on the agenda for this population. They don't like the feeling of displacement and loss of power, the feeling of not being at home in their own culture anymore. The sense that this is rightly our culture. It's a majoritarian thing, by the way, or formerly majoritarian thing. This is rightly our culture, and it's being taken away from us. They may believe, and often do, that the nation once belonged to them and should rightly belong to them and their value set and their religiosity. Now, sadly, often, not always, but often, all of this uncomfortableness has a racial and ethnic dimension as well. For example, maybe often this traditionalist group is of a predominant racial or ethnic group or identifies as such, like white. If among the cultural changes that occur, these include changes in the composition, racial, ethnic composition of the country through immigration, or the ending of racial ethnic segregation and the integration of the populations racially, or the rise in power of people who have historically been marginalized in terms of race and ethnicity, this population can, and sometimes does, extend their overall dislike for current culture in the direction of racism and anti-migrant, anti-immigrant animus. And so that gets into the mix as well. And that's certainly happening here. Now, the discomfort and anger of this population goes up a notch when they become convinced that leading institutions and figures in the culture are actively working against them and their beliefs. So this helps to account for the anti-elite kind of vibe in relation to business or educational institutions, to entertainment and media, to any institution that they believe is actively promoting values contrary to their own. Their dislike goes up even more intensely when they believe or perceive that government itself has turned against them. This can include civil servants and bureaucrats. And by the way, the attack on the administrative state is partly about this. The Project 2025 plan to gut the civil service and replace it with, loyalists is partly about the idea that the top level of the civil service at the state and federal level is filled with people whose values are contrary to their own. But it can also include leaders in the various branches of government. For example, in the US, the first target of this population's hostility within the government was the judicial branch, especially the Supreme Court, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision of '54, and then the Supreme Court decisions about prayer and Bible reading in schools in the early '60s, and then a series of Supreme Court decisions in the Warren Court, including abortion and birth control and so many other things. In fact, I'm old enough to remember when the main rhetoric of the Christian right was against the activist judiciary, the liberal activist judiciary. Fortunately, that's not a problem anymore. We've got that worked out. All right, so I used an acronym, ARC. I want to fill in the R and use the word reactionary. I think reactionary is a better word than nationalist to describe what we're talking about here. Reactionaries are people who respond to cultural changes that a significant part of the population considers positive, to respond with fierce negativity to cultural change. I read some political science literature about the politics of reaction, and essentially it's almost like hydraulics. Like if you have pressure heading in one direction for massive change, especially in a relatively short period of time, it almost inevitably evokes a counterreaction on the part of people who are not celebrating when everybody else is celebrating. They are angry. They believe these changes are misbegotten. They're not happy with them. So imagine a population that has settled into a fiercely reactionary posture towards pretty much every major social change since the 60s. So this has religious, moral, ethnic, migration, status, economic, social power dimensions, all of it. My claim is that, speaking mainly of the US here because that's our main concern, but I think there's a global dimension, a significant chunk of traditionalist Christians in the US have now settled into a politics of reaction. The level of fervor can vary. Maybe it just means they vote a certain way, but maybe for others, they are way around the bend in terms of conspiracy thinking, and maybe you add a layer of supernaturalist Christianity, and they believe that demonic powers have taken over the country, and they identify the Democratic Party with that. So QAnon, conspiracy thinking, and so on. They believe something cosmic and catastrophic has gone on, but however they pitch that or whatever they mainly focus their concern about, what they mainly have in common is a politics of reaction. It can happen in any culture, and there's increasing research on this even in Western Europe. I'm especially interested in the population of reactionary Christians in lands that have historically been dominated by majorities of Christians in population, but also in cultural power. So this is specifically a Christian phenomenon that I'm looking at, and that's the C. This is reactionary Christianity. These folks conceive of their negative reaction in explicitly religious terms. They believe that what has gone wrong is an attack on Christianity, and they are concerned that if they don't push back hard now, that Christianity itself will be lost. So this is reactionary Christianity. It becomes politically important only if there's enough people in this population to be relevant. If this is 2% of the population, it doesn't matter. If it's 25% of the population, which I think it probably is, it does matter. Okay? You can have a big impact with 25% of the population. If this population is activated for politics and turns militant enough, it can actually be a path not just towards normal political engagement, but towards religious extremism. I do ask us to think about, with maybe a bit of sympathy if possible, the rapidity of the social changes in this period. I'm old enough, I've lived through this whole period. The dramatic social changes that have happened, and a population, I've watched them backpedaling uneasily year after year, decade after decade. I've watched them say, here we stake our stand, we'll fight this one to the last man, and then lose. And then backpedal to the next hill, and then fight that, and then lose. And then backpedal, and then lose. I've seen that since the 70s. So you have a population increasingly embittered, panicky, angry, and feeling that it's not just normal politics that is at stake, but morality and Christianity. One way to look at Christian involvement in mission and culture in this country since the 60s has been as a series of strategies aiming to make America Christian again, and thus great again. You could go back to the Billy Graham Crusades and say that the strategy then was, we will convert all of our neighbors, and all of our neighbors will become good Bible-believing Christians, and we can make America Christian again. And that didn't succeed, though it looked pretty dramatic for a while. Or you could say that the various church strategies related to intensely discipling the young in whether in high school ministries or college ministries, parachurch ministries, was an effort to, you might say, put a protective bubble wrap around young people so that they would not be secularized or liberalized. You could look at cultural engagement strategies. You know, if we can't suppress all those liberalizing trends, maybe we can offer cultural products that will be better, like Christian music or Christian movies or Christian books. They don't have to read that stuff or listen to that stuff because we can offer something better. Educational strategies at every level should be considered. You look at, in this period, the rise of the homeschool movement and the rise of the Christian school movement, in part intended to carve out a space where Christian families could protect their kids from these cultural influences. And then in the 70s, there was the move towards mainstream democratic political organizing with the Christian right under people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, folks like that, the moral majority, the Christian coalition. The idea was to make an alliance with the Republican Party. We give you what you want, you give us what we want, and we can take America back through this strategy. And that strategy goes back to about 1976. So I think, as in retrospect, that the turn to politics partly reflected a loss of confidence in the cultural strategies. We don't appear to be able to evangelize our neighbors, so maybe we can win in politics. And for 40 years, the idea was every election, if we just elect enough good-hearted, Christian-leaning Republicans, from Ronald Reagan to George W. to whoever, then everything will be better. But I would say that by 2015, Christian right activists had believed, for good reason, that their strategy had failed. And I think of, I'm a preacher, so I tend to think of alliterative things. So I think of two things that contributed to this: Obama and Obergefell. 2 terms of Barack Obama for this population hit all their buttons. And Obergefell was the conservative Supreme Court under John Roberts legalizing gay marriage nationally, 2015. About that time, the Republicans had an open competition for who the next candidate would be for president. And with 17 options, if you remember, they chose Donald J. Trump. And at that point, the game changed. This is the only thing I'm going to say about Trump, unless you ask me questions and make me say more, okay? He really is a world historical figure. I say this after 9 years of sad watching. But what makes him such a figure is that from the beginning, he refused to play the game of democratic politics within the guardrails of the rules of democratic politics. More pointedly, according to political scientists Zablat and Levitsky, he represented a new kind of U.S. politician in openly striking authoritarian political notes. Their 4 criteria you might say the guardrails of democracy are respect for the democratic rules of the game, like the peaceful transfer of power, encouraging respect for election results, recognizing the legitimacy of political opponents, refusing to accept violence or threats of violence, respecting civil liberties of opponents, and respecting the role of the media. From the beginning, Trump challenged all of those things. These are simple criteria, but powerful ones, and Trump was already threatening them from his first campaign. Not to mention his open support and admiration for authoritarian political leaders like Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, even Kim in Brazil. In Korea, North Korea. What happened after the election in November 2020 took this authoritarianism into reality in ways that we had never seen before here, but that often happens in other countries whose democracies are less stable than ours. And what I want to say that is the great tragedy, but maybe not entirely a surprise, is that Trump added an authoritarianism, so that's the A, authoritarianism, to the reactionary Christianity that was already there, and created something that I think was new, at least in the power that it had developed, a political movement that was explicitly more and more authoritarian, reactionary, and Christian. So my fundamental concern and the main thesis of my book is that when a substantial population of traditional religious people who have positioned themselves in a reactionary posture in relation to their culture, and who are panicky because they believe their strategies are failing, their missional strategies and their democratic strategies, when they meet up with a clever politician who does 3 things, then you can have trouble. One is, this person proclaims that he or she, usually he, deeply shares their concerns and is their biggest advocate. I'm with you. Secondly, when he does not confine himself to the democratic rules of the game and therefore socializes people into accepting that we don't need to work within the democratic rules of the game anymore. And C, when he tempts this Christian population to follow him over the authoritarian cliff. This was Viktor Orban in Hungary, Vladimir Putin in Russia, though they never consolidated a democracy there, but they had a chance. I would say it was what the Law and Justice Party did in Poland. It's what Bolsonaro did in Brazil. In both of those cases, they were voted out. In our country, Trump was voted out. And yet here he is again. The base of all of these politicians is reactionary Christians who finally found in this figure the warrior they were looking for. That's why it's not about the leader's character. It's not about how many businesses he's bankrupted or any other thing, how many times he's been indicted. It's because this is the person who is tough enough to win the battle against the, fill in the blank, secularists, woke, liberals, etc. So my diagnosis is what we have is authoritarian, reactionary Christianity, now fully in the bloodstream of American politics, fundamentally through Trump. But now, whatever happens with Trump in November, there are now people who have been enrolled into the same idea. And so this is in our politics now for a while. So what is to be done? Well, it's not enough to say that we just need to defeat these people again and again and again, because we do. But we also need an intellectual and spiritual and moral answer. We need, if we're Christians, we need a way of defending non-reactionary, non-authoritarian politics. We need a way of defending democracy as a political system. And you don't know that you need to do that until it's threatened. And so what I did in the last part of the book, by the way, there's a chapter on each of the countries that I mentioned in the book. So there's a chapter on Russia, and you're going to talk about that, I think, and Poland and Brazil and Hungary and so on. I look back to the 19th century and early 20th century in France and Germany and see some of the same dynamics. You know, the Catholic Church positioned itself as anti-democratic pretty much until Vatican II. I mean, that was a long reactionary stand. Authoritarian reactionary politics within Christian circles goes very deep. It's relatively recently that it's been a mainstream thing for Christians to support democracy. And it's really partly that tradition that I describe in the book. DCA stands for Democratic, Covenantal, and Abolitionist strands in Christian intellectual history. I gave it to you early, but you still can't leave because you have to let me tell you a little bit more about each one of these, okay? My background is Baptist, and my mentor was a man named Glenn Stassen, whose father was Harold Stassen, who ran for president too many times towards the end of his career, but in the 50s was a serious progressive Republican who served in Eisenhower's cabinet, who was the first head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and who was an ardently committed little d Democrat. So I learned about the Baptistic democratic tradition at the feet of Glenn Stassen, who learned it from his father. But what Glenn Stassen said was the Baptists in the 17th century when they were born were among the first Christian groups to make arguments against the long history of authoritarianism, Christendom, suppression of religious dissent, heresy hunting, and church-state partnerships that had characterized pretty much the entire history of medieval Christianity. It was the Baptists, beginning in England, who said the state needs to get out of the religion business, that there need to be limits on government power, that the country belongs to the people and not to the monarch, that there should be a separation of church and state, that there should not be a religious establishment, that there should be human rights charters written into the constitutional order. And eventually they helped to contribute to the development of a distinctively Christian democratic vision. Before John Locke was making social contract arguments, the Baptists were making these kinds of arguments. Most political scientists would say that Western democratic thinking is a combination of the Enlightenment strand with Locke, for example, and the Christian strand with people like these Baptists. And so if we lose that voice, we lose an important part of our heritage. And sadly, many, many Baptists in the U.S. today have really gone over to authoritarianism instead of this democratic vision. So one of the things I say in the book is that one place where people learn democratic practice is in churches that practice democracy. And so any church in which there's things like a constitution and bylaws and votes and committees and budget hearings and amendments and all of that is a laboratory of democracy. And so that's where humble habits and practices of democracy are nurtured. And so here I'm making kind of a cultural argument. If enough people are schooled in democratic practices, they will be able to recognize authoritarian usurpation when it shows up. And I like to tell the story. I have a friend who told me about a major church down south that was running into all kinds of trouble. It was a Baptist church, Southern Baptist. And they had a rather promising candidate for their pastoral role, senior pastor role. And so they brought this candidate in for an interview, and he impressed, and so they were getting ready to consider offering him the job. And they asked him, what do you need? What do we got to give you for you to want to come here? What kind of money do you need, or whatever? What kind of staff? He said, I only want one thing, absolute power. That's all I want. I don't care about money. I just need it to be known that I am in charge of this church. And that church said, well, in light of all of our issues and so on, sure. That is a democratically governed church giving up democracy for authoritarianism. Countries can do that too. We are so concerned about this, or this problem that we are willing to trade our democracy with its messiness for an authoritarianism with its false promise of order and control. Maybe it's not a false promise, but definitely it's the end of democracy. And that church is still governed by that man to this day. He will not be dislodged until he dies, like authoritarians everywhere. So I argued the D is democracy, that the Baptists were among the first groups to understand that human communities do better if they are governed by the people as a whole instead of by the person at the top who sets the agenda and determines the rules and decides who's in and who's out and is not governed by any constraints. My C here is covenantal. And here I was especially interested in reading about the Puritan movement in England during the same period that introduced the concept that the church is a covenant community. One reason the Puritans critiqued the Anglican establishment was because it was understood that it was a hierarchical community that was governed by the monarch through the bishops and the clergy down to the people. And they said, actually, the governor of a Christian church should be Jesus, but the people are the ones who make a covenant together to determine what following Jesus will look like. And the idea that church community and maybe also political community should be understood as covenantal made its way across the Atlantic and came here, including to New England with the Puritans. I actually quote the Massachusetts state constitution in my book because it has such a covenantal kind of feel to it. We, the people of Massachusetts, make a compact to order our life in such and such a way. 1780, for 240 odd years, you might say that the people of Massachusetts have been operating off of a covenant. And so what I do in the book is to reflect on constitutionalism as a kind of covenantalism. We're not just free agents seeking, or shouldn't think of ourselves as free agents seeking maximum liberty to do whatever we want, nor should we think of ourselves as Christians attempting to dominate the body politic for our vision, but instead as participants in a democratic covenant in which everybody has equal status and equal rights, and in which we understand that people who do not share our convictions are equally to be treated as members of the community. Another thing I say in the discussion of covenant is that at every level, we need leaders who think in a covenantal way about their responsibilities. You know how the way we do that in every January 20th is that the president-elect puts his or her hand on a Bible and makes a covenant vow to, remember the language, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. if we elect people who have no sense of covenant fidelity, they will not be trustworthy in their covenantal commitment. And when you have people who are fundamentally uncommitted to covenant, then it's going to be really hard for the covenant community to survive or to thrive. The peace and good order of the community require the voluntary assent and participation and commitment to the covenant. So that's police officers and mayors, school principals and attorney generals and military people and presidents. If you lose a covenantal sensibility, you're in trouble. Laws are not going to be sufficient. And then the last strand that I talk about in the book is the abolitionist Christianity of the African American democratic dissenting tradition. The grand black democratic tradition in the U.S., which goes back 400 years, and which has been saying from the beginning that this country has to decide whether everybody here is going to be included on equal terms in the covenant, or whether this is going to be a white ethnocracy with quasi-democratic elements, which is really how we began. And so reformist voices as far back as the 17th century, but with highlights with people like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois and Fannie Lou Hamer and so on, Martin Luther King, have been saying we need a new democratic covenant in which everybody is included on equal terms. And doesn't that seem like a healthier vision than this authoritarian, reactionary Christianity which says, actually, no, this country is our country, everybody else, maybe they can stay as long as they understand that we are the ones that are in charge. That is the vision that is being offered, I think, on the other side. So to conclude, I am arguing that illiberal, anti-democratic, reactionary authoritarianism is a legitimate threat to the health and survival of our democracy. That Donald Trump, more than any politician before, has learned to build a political coalition fired by this sentiment. That it got him elected once, and it might get him elected again. That the main reason to oppose him and the movement that has begun to be remorphed or has been morphed in his name, in his image, is because our democracy is worth preserving. That Christians, if we are self-identified Christians, we have resources within our own tradition to say no to this. We don't need authoritarian, reactionary Christianity to have another chance at power. That was what was in charge for a long time. It doesn't go very well. It suppresses human rights. It violates the rule of law. It suppresses religious and conscientious minorities. And it's just a species of authoritarianism which I thought we had made a decision to reject in this country a long time ago. I do think that when Christians are afraid to, or don't know how to articulate their political perspectives in explicitly Christian terms like the ones that I'm describing, it can seem that the authoritarians have all the Christian language, and what we have is secular stuff. My argument is that for 400 years, fine Christian thinkers and activists have been articulating the case for democracy in explicitly Christian terms, and that is a resource that we must draw on today. In one sense, we're dealing with fundamentally different Christian visions. A Christianity that is about including everybody on equal terms, that celebrates cultural changes that have welcomed more and more people into the community, as opposed to a Christianity that is about a fierce negative reaction to those who are different, to a more egalitarian and inclusive society. And that's what is at stake in November. And unfortunately, it will continue to be at stake for a while to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. If you have reactions or questions, keep those in mind, but we'll kind of begin our response time. Again, we've invited a local scholar from right here in Boston, Dr. Riccardi Schwartz, to share a bit about her research and work, or response to talk, however you feel led. But welcome, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me tonight, and thank you, David, for this really masterful book. It was such a joy to read, so if you haven't got it already, please do so on your way out, because it's an important read. I'm an anthropologist. I study the far right in the United States, and as any good anthropologist, I have to open with a story, because I have to tell you about my field site. I lived between 2017 and 2018 in the mountains of West Virginia. I lived with a community of American converts to the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. These were white Americans who decided, largely Protestant, Catholic backgrounds, that they wanted to become Russian Orthodox. And with their embrace of Russian Orthodoxy also came an embrace of Putin's illiberal politics. I lived with them for that year. I wrote a book about them. And eventually I started tracking the larger trends that David has talked about already in terms of global authoritarianism. And one of the major things that I brought back with me from the field was a night that I spent with a community. It was July 4th. I was at the local Russian Orthodox parish. There were fireworks in the sky. There was a flag cake. And I remember the priest looking up into the sky. This is a man who went to Oral Roberts University. He'd spent his life as a Southern Baptist before he converted to Russian Orthodoxy. And he said, "God bless the red, white, and blue." And by that, I mean Russia. So 3 things I want to talk about really briefly before we get to tackling David with all of the questions that I know we have, right? First, I want to say that this idea of reactionary Christianity is massively huge in a moment when we are saturated with this idea of Christian nationalism, right? Christian nationalism has existed across the globe in many different types of manifestations. We see it in Russia, absolutely. We see it now in Russia, but it has a long traction in Russian history. But reactionary Christian authoritarianism, which I think you're trying to press at here, is so important because it's not just about drawing on that strongman ideology. It's not just a nostalgia for what has been, right? The Americana of the 1950s that we tend to associate with Christian nationalists. This is about a sort of futuristic world-building project, right? So think about Project 2025, which we've heard blasted through the news recently, right? There is an architecture, a design, a potential for another world, right? And what we have to think about, those of us who are Christians who don't want that type of Christian world for the future, is how will we then create our own Christian future that is not reactionary, but is uplifting and liberative. Number 2, I really appreciate David pulling out these globalized dimensions. If we think back to when Putin invaded Ukraine and the many speeches that he gave, if any of you sat through those, they were exhausting and quite rambly. He often talked about the metaphysical dimensions of why he decided to go to war with Ukraine. He also had Patriarch Kirill, who is the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, give sermons and give statements talking about why they invaded Ukraine, the justification for that. And the justification hinged on the idea that the West is in decline, that the West has secularized, that the West has liberalized, and we can't have that type of metaphysical contamination affecting Russia. Right? So that idea of closing borders, of securing land and power in order not just to push away a potential political threat, but to push away a spiritual threat. That was instrumental in his message to Russians and why he invaded Ukraine. One of the things Putin has also done, he has said recently, we need to have more migrants to Russia, which sort of goes against, paradoxically, his push to sort of Russianize Russia. one of the constituents that he wants to bring in as refugees to Russia are ideological migrants from the West. So he's very interested in gathering people who are outside of Russia, who feel like they are dissidents to the sort of culture they live in, right? So think of American sort of reactionary conservative Christians who are very disillusioned with what they see as the decline of the West. And he wants to bring them to Russia in order to save them from Western decay. So this is part, again, of this sort of strongman authoritarianism, but it's hinging, again, on these sort of metaphysical or spiritual dimensions, right? Rather than just a sort of political ideology. And finally, what can we do, right? I think David's talk was so liberative at the end and very hopeful. And one of the things we can take away from it is that we have to think about how we want to build our future, right? We have a population of reactionary Christians who are not just mobilizing for this election, they are mobilizing long-term. They have a strategic plan for the future. So if you think of how corporations build themselves, right? They have sort of a vision statement, they have a strategic first-year plan, 5-year plan, 10-year plan. We're seeing this play out in real time. So the question then for people who believe in a good ethical and moral future that's inclusive, embracing, and also brings to bear our own sort of Christ-centered personalities in the world to affect and shape it for good is how will we build out those futures? What does that look like? And how can we actually do that both locally and in the sort of global context? And I have two things I'm going to end with. First, in the local community, it's about interdependence on one another. When I was in the field, one of the things I noticed is that the community around the Russian Orthodox Church was very distant from them. And these were largely other Christian denominations. So we had a wide variety, Baptist, Methodist, Assemblies of God. And I would talk to all of the pastors in the community, and they would say, they're kind of weird. They keep to themselves. They don't want to engage with us, right? And they would have conversations about this community. But the one thing they said is that in sort of reacting to this community, they felt that engaging with each other and standing in solidarity on things that they valued and appreciated, even if they had ideological differences, was important for the support and continuance of their community in the face of sort of this authoritarian microcosm in Appalachia. And two, we need to be reading broadly because the Christian nationalism or the reactionary Christianity that we see here is not unmoored from all of the different points that David has talked to us about tonight. So if we're thinking about Christian nationalism, which I would argue, David, so many scholars besides you do only think about it sort of in the American context, right? American white Christian nationalism. If we're thinking about it just like that, we are recapitulating that American exceptionalism, right? That America is the only place where this is happening. But no, it's happening everywhere. And so if we're mindful of that and we watch the sort of through lines that are spreading around the world, sort of like those pipes that go underneath the ocean, allowing us to have internet access across the world, right? If we think about how those ideologies are also spreading across the world that way, we have a better chance of understanding how they move, how they flow, and how they take their shape, right? And what we can do about it in the future. So thank you, David, for this great book. It was a privilege to engage your work, and I look forward to all the questions you get.
Sarah, thanks so much. Very briefly taking us from the hills of West Virginia to the Putin's war on Ukraine and to all kinds of interesting both global and local thoughts about what we do about this. So thanks for that rich response.